We're discussing the relationship between China and the United States as we mark the 35th anniversary of the normalization of relations between the two nations. Joining us now from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is an international expert on Chinese issues, and it's always great to have you on the broadcast. Let me ask you, Victor, take us back in time to 1979, this historic moment in time. How was it viewed there in China?
Well, first of all, when Deng Xiaoping re-emerged from persecution in China for the third time, he became the paramount leader. And one of the first things he did was to normalize relations between China and the United States when President Carter was the U.S. president at that time. And that was one of the most important historical events in modern history because China and the United States normalized the relations and they cooperated closely, which eventually led to the collapse of the former Soviet Union. And I think ever since then, the relations between China and the United States, despite of many ups and downs, bumpiness, etc., have been more or less very well handled. And eventually, it is a relationship of mutual benefit for the Chinese nation as well as for the people in the United States.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I want to take us back in time a little bit because we have an expression here in the United States, I'd love to be a fly on the wall for some of these meetings. You were that person there in those meetings, an interpreter for Deng Xiaoping. Talk to me about what a heady time that must have been for you, sitting there witnessing history like that.
I was very privileged and honored to be a witness to history. And I was present during many other important meetings between China and the United States, either involving Deng Xiaoping here in Beijing or during many top-level delegations from the Chinese government visiting the United States. I would say from Deng Xiaoping's perspective, relations between China and the United States was the most important relations, and he attached a lot of importance to nurturing and developing the relations between the two governments and also between the Chinese military and the American military. And I think it's because of Deng Xiaoping's wisdom and courage and vision, as well as working closely with the American leaders at that time, that the United States and China could turn the corner and really elevate their bilateral relations to a height. And that actually paved the foundation for the robust bilateral relations even up to today. Bilateral trade between the two countries is more than 500 billion US dollars. And I think for the United States, this very robust and healthy bilateral trade between the two countries helped to create many, many jobs in the United States. On the Chinese side, we also benefit tremendously from cooperating closely with the United States. So I would say now that we can reflect back to the normalization of the relations between China and the United States, no one will disagree with me when I say this relations between China and the United States have become the most important set of bilateral relations in the world today and will remain so for many years and decades to come. So we should not forget the great contribution by people like Deng Xiaoping, like former President Carter, Mr. Brzezinski, etc., to promoting the relations between our two countries.
Let me ask you this, though. There's a schizophrenic quality to this relationship, though, too. One day they look, these two countries look like partners. The next day they look like rivals. How do you see it? Do you see that tension that continues to exist?
Yes, you're right. I think if you look at, specific episodes in our bilateral relations, you do see this kind of up and down and sporadic, incidents, etc. However, if you pause and look at the totality of the relations between our two countries, I would say more or less it is being very well managed, despite of these problems. I think one thing which is still missing is that in the United States, there may still be some people who have not yet come to the terms of the prospect that China eventually will become a larger economy than the United States. So they have some misgivings about that, and they may want to understand better whether and what is China's real strategic intention, for example.
Well, what do you say
on the Chinese side, I think...
Let me just ask you, though, what do you say to those Americans who do fear China? Because you've kind of touched on it right there.
Exactly. I think from the Chinese perspective, we need to make ourselves better known to the Americans. We need to really engage with the United States at multiple levels, including, very private and confidential channels of communication between the top leader here in China and the top leader in the United States, so that the two sides can really understand each other. From the Chinese perspective, there is no reason and no strategic intention at all not to cooperate fully and constructively with the United States. Why? Because if you look at the past history over 35 years, China is a beneficiary of cooperating with the United States. And the United States, on the other hand, is also a beneficiary. So no one should rock the boat. And I think in the world today, the good relations and close cooperation between China and the United States will be even more important.
There's been some tensions, the ADIZ. Are there any concerns on your part that, and you know how these events happen in history, that somehow these two major powers could stumble into a confrontation?
Of course, I would say, on one hand, the situation in the East China Sea is very tense, and if any side makes a misjudgment, the situation may actually get out of control. And this is exactly the time when reason and sanity need to prevail here in China, there in Washington, D.C., as well as in Tokyo. And I think we need to put a stop to any acts of provocation which may push the situation over the brink and into an abyss. And I think the United States, as a top leader in the world today, need to exercise its wisdom and leadership and urge Japan to back down from this very dangerous path. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan paid a visit, and his respect to the war criminals enshrined in the Yasukuni Shrine, and it has aroused the condemnation throughout the world, even from the United States. And I think the United States need to be aware of the possibility of appeasement if it does not act courageously and timely and effectively in urging Japan to back down from that path of rearming itself and posing another threat to the neighboring countries like China, like South Korea, which itself is an ally of the United States. So I would say in East China Sea, let's talk in a peaceful manner about whatever issue there may be, territorial dispute included, and let's make sure that this part of the world remains in peace and stability for the benefit of all of us.
Victor,
that's the only sensible way to resolve these issues.
Victor, let me ask you another quick question. We're kind of running out of time, and I want to get to this. Dr. Brzezinski in our interview was very critical of the press there in China. He said that the Chinese press is censored. What do you say to Americans who still hold this belief so dear to their hearts?
Well, yes, of course. I think there is censorship in China to a certain degree, but I would say that each country has its own short list of sensitive issues. In China, for example, we cannot tolerate any talk about independence of Taiwan, and we cannot even tolerate any talk about, Diaoyu Island not being the Chinese territory, for example, or Tibetan independence. But other than these short list of hot button issues, I would say now that we have close to 1 billion mobile phone users, close to about 600 million internet users, people do talk a lot, and in most cases very freely without any constraints on the internet, on their mobile phone, etc. We need to put this issue in historical context, and I would say with greater freedom of expression here, the people here in China will benefit from that.
Well, Victor, it's not the C word censor, it's the C word clock. We've run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us from Beijing. It's always a pleasure. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.